It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Jason Beal. He's the OFAC Director for Huntington National Bank, which wasn't that long ago when I started. Everybody would talk about if he had any questions. Jason can help you. And I met this individual, and he's been just super to work with. Strong team that he works with. He's not able to be here in person today. For the presentation was a little more than he wanted to try to swing, as his plate is usually pretty busy and pretty full. But he leads a pretty much to anybody that wants to sign up and attend, but typically 70 to 100 people. Bank on current compliance issues, and it's just been something everybody actually space that doesn't always happen. So I'm excited to have Jason join us today. You want to kind of give a little bit of your and get us started, that would be great.
Hello? Can you guys hear me now?
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
Okay, great. So just since I am off-site, the signal has been a little bit choppy. So if there are questions, if you can refer them back to Arlene, and she can send them to me via chat. Just because when I'm getting audio from the conference, it's pretty choppy. So please, just if you do that, that would be helpful. And if I'm choppy, please let me know. Kind of look scared or something when you're on the screen. Yeah, that'll be great. So thank you, Paul and Vugar and BAFT for inviting me here to speak today. Again, sorry I wasn't able to attend in person. We have a lot of things going on with sanctions at the moment, so it wasn't going to be possible to come down there. But I am excited to speak, and hopefully what I'm going to say is informative. And also, please, I know I'm what's keeping everybody from lunch. So if you can, sort of do the, when we get close to lunchtime, I can't see all the faces of hungry people that are gonna start tearing things down if they don't get to their lunches. So, well, good. Yeah, it's a little introduction of myself, and then I'll jump into subject matter that you'll all hopefully find interesting. I've been at Huntington now for 5 years. I'm the OFAC director here at Huntington. Huntington started out when I got here was a good-sized regional bank. We're now a top 20 bank. I'm not going to say that has anything to do with me, but it has happened while I was here. But we do have a very strong international program that Paul is one of our leaders in that program. And so we do have, for a Midwest bank, I thought I was coming to the Midwest to get into kind of a quiet sanction space, but there's been a lot of interesting things happening in the international space, and some things that, again, we have to adjust as sanctions change to make sure we're properly complying with those sanctions. So let's jump in. And if there are questions, if you guys can feed them to Arlene, she can send them to me via chat, and I'll try to answer them. I'm going to try to move relatively quickly through my presentation. I'm going to start with some basics, and then hopefully kind of explain some of the complexities that we're going to be seeing in international sanctions. That they're obviously, for those of you who are following it, it's there today. I think I'll talk about it more, but with the Russia sanctions, it's gotten more complex. So just briefly, sanctions are regulations by a government that prohibit activities with individuals, entities, or countries. And what's covered by those sanctions is beyond just wire transactions and what banks do, but it covers all kinds of economic activity, including shipping, exportation of goods and services. And so the implementation that applies to banks also applies to individuals, companies, that engage in any kind of particularly international kinds of commerce. As you're all aware, penalties can be severe. We've seen penalties in the hundreds of thousands and even billions of dollars, depending on the severity of the sanctions. We'll talk about a few of those. And the sanctions can be country-based or they can be multilateral. And what we're seeing, especially with the Russia context, is that the overlapping nature of the sanctions is not always even. One country may say this is prohibited, and another may allow that activity. So one of the big issues that we run into, Canada, if you're familiar, the United States has sanctions against Cuba and has since the 1960s. Canada has anti-sanctions against Cuba, and we're very close partners with Canada. So how do you, if you're doing business with Canada and the United States, that becomes tricky with how you thread that needle. And most countries have some kind of economic sanctions program. And that's something that came out pretty much after 9/11, as the international community really pushed for countries to have sanctions on terrorism financing, but it also expanded into the other terrorism programs. Excuse me. So one of the fundamentals to understand with sanctions is who or what it applies to. And so the first thing, and I'm going to use U.S. sanctions as the example because that's probably the most comprehensive of the sanctions programs out there, but the same principles apply to other countries. So who does it apply to first? U.S. for the United States, any party in the United States, anybody in the United States, company, business, individual, whatever, if you're in the United States, you must follow the U.S. sanctions. If you don't, and even if you don't know that those sanctions apply to you, they still apply to you. This means that when Kim Jong-il comes to the United Nations to present at the UN, U.S. sanctions apply to him. Now, how that gets enforced is a totally different issue. But the second thing that applies is U.S. citizens anywhere. So if I go live abroad, I work for a foreign company, I still have to follow U.S. sanctions, even if the company that I work for doesn't necessarily have to follow U.S. sanctions, but I, as an individual, sanctions still apply to me. And this third one is really the one that has gotten the biggest fines and gets the most international parties tripped up, and that is any transaction that goes through the United States that hits U.S. jurisdiction and sanctions apply to that. And we'll talk about some examples of that. The fourth thing, U.S. origin goods and services. So, and this also has been a complicated thing. If something is made in the United States, has U.S. parts in it, there's a whole raft of things that applies to the U.S.ness, the sanctions and the control of that product continues with the product even after it leaves the United States. Maybe a good example of that would be, let's say, an aircraft engine. So they get wet leased and it may get sent to, there was a penalty for a company that had wet leased an aircraft engine to an entity in the UAE who used it on, a couple different countries, and it ended up on a plane in Sudan. Well, you need to know where your aircraft engine is, and the company involved in that got penalized for their U.S. origin good showing up in a sanctioned country. What is not covered by the sanctions are transactions with no U.S. nexus. That doesn't mean, and then I'm going to follow that with, but there are something called secondary sanctions, which the U.S. really pushed probably about 6 or 7 years ago, maybe 8 years ago, where they were looking at really tightening the screws on the Iran sanctions, and they went around the U.S. Treasury. And my background, I was with Treasury for 13 years. I was at the Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC. And part of that time I was in the Middle East. I was the first regional attaché in the Middle East, serving in Bahrain and in the UAE. And while I was there, one of the things that the U.S. Treasury Department was pushing was implementation of U.S. sanctions on Iran. And so they made it clear to foreign banks, foreign countries, that if you're the company that is going to be the major provider of support to Iran, then you could be targeted under these secondary sanctions programs. So it's pretty extensive. All right, so we talked about penalties, some of the big penalties. $8.9 billion BNP Paribas paid for almost 4,000 transactions. Same thing, SocGen, Societe Generale, paid 1.3 billion in penalties. The key thing with both of these is that jurisdictional hook, that item that I mentioned before. These transactions were going through the United States, and if the transaction goes to the United States, it needs to follow U.S. sanctions and requirements. And so with the two biggest the big penalties, what you're going to see is it's not that they were accidentally sending some transactions to the United States. They would have some kind of policy or procedure in place to either strip out information or intentionally not let the U.S. party know what was ultimately happening through their financial institutions. I'm not going to read all of this. I think you guys will be able to see this in the recording afterwards. But this is one of the big things, and Paul mentioned we do a monthly training. One of the things we're always working on, and this is a great tool to use to learn about OFAC, is the settlements that come out. The United States will regularly penalize companies, banks, individuals that violate the sanctions, and they publicly announce those settlements, and they're kind of a what not to do in sanctions. And so those are great. It's a great way to learn and to understand. And we're often like going, oh, they got in trouble for that. Well, we need to see what am I doing? Do I need to change something so that I can avoid being in the same situation? This particular one is interesting. It's an Australian company called Toll Holdings, and they are an international freight forwarding company. And what happened with them is they were doing transactions, like physical transactions, to countries like North Korea, Iran, Syria. But when the payments for those transactions were being processed, they were hiding information. They were avoiding including the names of sanctioned jurisdictions on invoices. Their bank found out about it. Their bank started asking questions about it, enhanced due diligence, and they eventually realized, we can't do that. But it took them about 2 years to really clean up their act and stop having these issues. And just hopefully I'm not telling anybody anything they don't already know, but if you have to lie to your bank about some transaction you're doing, you probably shouldn't be doing it. And from a bank side, if I'm talking to a customer and they're not providing information, they're doing something evasive, like if it's an accident, it's an accident. But if I'm asking them questions and they're evading and they're not providing complete information or providing false invoices or whatever, like that's not going to be a customer that shouldn't be a customer of my bank much longer. So Toll was probably a big enough customer that they kept them on, but they were pretty concerned with them as a relationship. So don't hide information from your bank, be honest. So sanctions risks, and this, the Russian sanctions are a really interesting case study because we've seen a number of things. Number one, fastest growth of sanctions that I've seen that probably have ever happened. I was at a conference right after the sanctions were implemented, and the unprecedented was said by every speaker so many times. It was an unprecedented use of unprecedented. Because of the quick advance, the targeting of major financial institutions, all the major Russian banks have been designated at this point, individuals, entities, etc. Sanctions, as you're probably aware, the sanctions don't just cover individuals and companies, but there are certain territories that are controlled by the Russians in Ukraine right now that are also sanctioned areas. That's, I'm going to tell you, is super hard to implement because it's hard to identify transactions to those areas because is it called Russian? Is it called Ukrainian? Depends on who you ask, who's doing the transaction. So it's important to really pay attention. And then the other thing that we've seen is it's not just, if you think of sanctions as just a list, like here's the OFAC list and we just need to screen everything against the list, you're missing a big part of the picture. And I will tell you that the biggest penalties that you will see from OFAC were not on list-based programs, but on country-based programs. Sudan, for some reason, is like always, people are always getting in trouble for Sudan. Sudan is no longer comprehensively sanctioned, but when it was, there were just all these transactions with Sudan that people, I don't know why they thought they could get away with it, but they would do those transactions, and those were the biggest penalties. So you have country prohibitions. In addition, with Russia, we've got prohibitions on U.S. Oil to the United States, luxury goods, providing services. So it's important to understand to look beyond just, it's a list. Don't stop thinking that. And if you're in global trade, which I'm assuming this audience is, then, where is your goods and services coming from, going to? Like the complication of the sanctions is going to be the U.S. is prohibiting Russian oil, but Europe is not just yet. And when will that change? And do you say, hey, I'm going to buy that oil because it might be going for cheap now, but by the time I get it to my port, it's going to be sanctioned because sanctions are changing. And that's the other big complexity with the sanctions is this, what may be okay. And this is something we tell our customers all the time. It may be okay for you to do this transaction today, but in a month, it may not be. That party may be sanctioned. So there's this, ever evolving nature. And so the longer, as the way I kind of think about it, a wire transaction is kind of easy to work with sanctions compliance because it's once and done. A letter of credit could be months, could be years. When it started, it was okay. When it's finished, it may not be okay. So the importance of sort of vigilance on those kind of longer term transactions. And so I'm pulling up an example of sort of another complication that we're seeing in, I'll see when that pops up on your slide. There we go. One of the other complications is that historically the U.S. has kind of led out and in terms of designating different parties and individuals. And so the other international lists from EU, UK, UN, et cetera, have been derivative of what the U.S. has. With the Russian sanctions, we've seen very different approaches. The UK has a list, the EU has a list, Canada has a list, OFAC has, the US has a list. They may not all be the same. And there's one kind of, there's many, but here's a really potent example, a guy named Vladimir Potanin. He's probably, different articles I thought he was either the second richest or one of the richest individuals in Russia. He got sanctioned by the UK in 2022, in June 2022, but he hasn't been sanctioned by the EU or the UK. So as a financial institution, I need to thread that needle of, well, if I have a transaction that involves Ross Bank, which is now owned by this guy, I need to make sure, is that transaction going through the UK? Because if it's going through the UK, it could be blocked. If it's going through the EU, it shouldn't be blocked. How do I deal with that? What risk-based approach do I take? Do I say, I'm just not going to do business with Ross Bank now because it's too risky? So that's, each bank needs to take its own, and individuals, right? Because again, you may say, hey, I'm going to go to another bank that doesn't have the same risk tolerance. And it may be that Ross Bank now gets sanctioned by the United States. So you went with that higher risk entity because it was what you're trying to do, and now it's prohibited. So yes, this part of threading that needle through the complexity of the new Russian sanctions is pretty problematic. So to kind of talk about some red flags related to trade transactions, and I'm going to read through these because I think they're pretty interesting, and hopefully you all are very aware of them and paying attention to these kinds of things. I've got there's a couple examples on the left on the right of, and they're kind of blurry, sorry about that, but these are bills of lading for some North Korean payments that the UN identified as they had declared one kind of cargo for those payments, but it turns out it was really munitions that they were shipping to North Korea. So, I think there's always the question, well, how do I know, right? How do I know what sanctions and what if they're lying to me and whatever? And I think, with OFAC, they had something called a strict liability regime, which means whether or not you could be penalized for doing a transaction. However, there's also a reasonableness test, and if I have a reasonable process in place, I do my due diligence, and my customer lies to me and does everything, everything's kind of on their side, then I probably am not going to be penalized for what my customer is doing. And if there's no reason for me to know, if there's not an expectation that as a bank, I'm going to go down to the ship and inspect all the goods and make sure, well, it says this on the bill of lading, then that's really what happened. So, what is my level of knowledge? What is my level of culpability? Those are things to really factor in. So what are the kinds of things that would be red flags for sanctions exposure? Dates, delivery dates are vague. One of the other things we'll kind of talk about a little bit is, vessels that move to prohibited jurisdictions like North Korea, or for the United States, Cuba. If they're saying, hey, this boat is going to go from Florida to Venezuela and it's going to take 3 weeks, well, that doesn't make any sense. Why would it take it 3 weeks to make maybe a 4-day journey? Well, that's probably because it's making a stop in Cuba on its way down to Venezuela. So why would you not have clear dates on something? PO box as a goods delivery location, address that is similar but or exact to someone who's on the list. So you should think about not just screening names, but potentially addresses of parties on a transaction. The final destination is a freight forwarder, which, as we all know, means that's not the final destination. They're going to send it on to someone else. So who really is the true customer? Transshipping through another safe jurisdiction. So, maybe if someone's trying to send goods to Iran, they're going to send it to Turkey or the UAE first before they send it to Iran. And there may be sort of a parallel or a shadow letter of credit that involves the true final destination. We already talked a little bit about vessels that are involved in goods transfer that have entered into ports that are prohibited. So there's rules about vessels that go through Cuba, for example. There's I can't remember but it's like a 90 day or 6 month cooling off period if a vessel touches Cuban port, that it can't transact with the United States. And then goods are originated or delivered to an area near a prohibited geography. One of the things that OFAC has highlighted is shipments going to, I think it's the Dandong area of China, which is right up near North Korea. So I'm all the way there next to it. Maybe I'm just going to hop over into North Korea and deliver my goods. So that's something to watch out for. And then a big one, and this should just raise every kind of red flag. If someone says, hey, can you not mention a certain country, or don't tell them about this, or if they're trying to evade something or not provide information, like that is a huge red flag that you really need to escalate and ask additional questions to confirm that something is okay. Finally, customers that aren't concerned about additional costs, they're like, oh, it's going to take twice as long to get there. That's fine. I don't care. Or a shipment that doesn't make sense, like sending coffee beans to to Colombia. So those are the kind of things, again, to be aware of for potential sanctions. And also there's a lot that follows there for money laundering as well, money laundering and trade-based money laundering. So there was, just to kind of flesh this out a little bit, there was a recent example that OFAC did a penalty about, or is actually a designation, excuse me. On October 7th, there was a designation of some companies and ships related to North Korean ship-to-ship transfers. And so this particular example, there was a ship called Courageous or C Prima, and there are obviously satellite photos of it doing ship-to-ship transfers out in the ocean of oil or other goods that then are were sent on to North Korea. And I think the key thing to think about here is, is there the other thing that there's some great guidance that OFAC put out about having a compliance program. And as you think about that, it should be, what is my risk? What is my level of sophistication? What is my level of exposure? So if I'm a Midwest bank that the only transactions I do are with Midwest customers, well, then my level of exposure and the kinds of controls I need to put in place are going to be significantly lower than if I'm a big international bank that's dealing with kind of all the countries in Southeast Asia, right? So if my exposure there is so much greater, then the tools and the kinds of attention I need to increase commensurate with those risks. So a tool, one of the kinds of tools that's out there that could be purchased is there are tools that show you where vessels go. So I search the name, hey, this boat, let me double check to make sure that didn't go to a prohibited location. So that's kind of a tool to consider to avoid those kinds of sanctions risk. And it kind of addressed this already, but what OFAC always talks about taking a risk-based approach, and what that means is essentially what I was saying, where what is the kind of activity I am involved in, and am I putting the right controls in place for that activity? So, for example, as I mentioned in one of the first slides, every person in the United States is responsible for U.S. sanctions. Does that mean that the guy, the 7-Eleven down the street or the convenience store down the street needs to have a customer screening program to screen all of its customers that come in? No, because their risk is way low relative to an international bank or an export company that's dealing with high-risk jurisdictions, right? So institutions, financial institutions, companies all need to figure out what is their risk, what is their risk appetite, and are they appropriately controlling for really the highest risk things that they're doing. And like I say in the third bullet there, the screening should fit the nature of the transaction. So, a wire, I only need to screen it once. Goes through, I screen it once. Where a letter of credit, it's an item that exists for a lot of time, and so having some kind of screening process that checks it over time to make sure that if it was okay at the beginning of the process, it's still okay at the end of the process. The other thing is potential evasion tactics. Transactions to Turkey and the UAE may really be transshipments to Iran. And then performing the right kind of due diligence and having the important thing, if you're like, hey, we're a sophisticated institution, but we have no due diligence process, that's not going to fly. If you have an extensive process and someone is lying to you and hiding the information, you say, hey, we followed all of our steps. So that's going to be a much better story to tell than we've got no process, we were hoping for the best. We trust our customers. And again, sort of reiterating, as you're thinking about that risk-based approach, U.S. sanctions do not apply to all transactions. They apply to transactions that route through the United States. So a foreign-to-foreign transaction that has no U.S. nexus, has no U.S. goods, U.S. sanctions don't apply to it. As I mentioned before, though, that might, depending on which jurisdiction you're in, you need your own jurisdiction. If I'm in the EU, I'm looking at my local jurisdiction plus the EU jurisdiction. So what are the restrictions that apply to where I'm at, where I'm going through, the goods that are involved? So there's a lot involved there. And then finally, that mention of secondary sanctions, that maybe I'm okay with maybe I'm totally foreign. However, I've decided, hey, we're going to make a lot of money because Iran's trying to sell oil, and we're going to be the bank that does all the Iran oil. Well, that's putting a target on yourself to potentially be targeted for secondary sanctions. So again, the things that the risk-based approach and the things that folks need to weigh and see what their risk tolerance is. And then just some final points. And I think this, hopefully this goes without saying, but you're responsible for the information that you have. So if I have no knowledge, you know, if all I see is the letter of credit and don't know that they're hiding an additional set of information that, you know, indicates that this is really ammunition and not grain, I'm responsible for the information I have. But as those red flags pop up, it's important to ask those questions and be skeptical of when things don't make sense. They almost always don't make sense, right? When you start asking questions, I'll give a random example. We stopped a transaction. We asked questions about, this is not a trade related one. We asked questions about the transaction and said, hey, who's this going to? And the person's response was, I don't remember their name. And I met them at a bar. And these are all like, like this is not your friend. This is something wrong with this transaction, and that's something that you should escalate and probably reject. So then the other thing that, and this is really going to be a concern coming up, is, you know, as we're, what are we, about 8 months, 9 months into massive sanctions on Russia, what has already started happening, and we just need to be aware of, is how are the Russians evading the sanctions that are in place, right? So, you know, are you looking at, you know, we had customers that were doing perfectly fine transactions with Russian parties in, you know, this time last year. If that customer said, hey, I'm totally cutting my ties with Russia, great. If they did not intend to do so, and they just found, hey, we're going to make those transactions through India now or some other country, that may be a problem, because typically the sanctions, it really depends on what it is, but typically the sanctions don't say, well, all you need to do is go around the sanctions in order to do what you're trying to do. So that's something to definitely be watching out for. Having said that, there's also, you know, again, it's understanding the specifics of the sanctions. There are some instances, for example, with Iran transactions, where there are certain transactions that are allowed, and OFAC will say, you know, as long you're trying to get your inheritance from Iran, what you need to do is that you sell the property in Iran, and it needs to go through a third country and then on to the United States, which looks like the definition of evading sanctions. But that's what OFAC will tell you needs to happen, because there is no direct financial connection between U.S. banks and Iranian banks. So sometimes things that look like evasion may not be evasion, but if you're trying to get around the sanctions, then without asking, that's probably a red flag for something to watch out for. And yeah, that third bullet, the largest penalties historically have been these country sanctions, where people have said, hey, we're just going to ignore the sanctions and we're going to work around it. And that's definitely going to be problematic. I think that's the end of my prepared remarks. Vugar, Paul, I don't know, we're right at 12:30, and we have questions or.
Jason.
I
Okay,
guess,
Jason, can you?
Go ahead.
Educating customers about some of the sanctions programs, and I'm talking mainly about like small is savvy.
So sorry, the sound is really choppy for me. So if Arlene, if you could probably put the question, as she does it, if you can just kind of summarize the question into the chat so I can see it, because I get like half of what she's saying.
It's long, but what's your perspective on educating SME programs, and does Treasury perceive that as aiding?
If we could summarize the question. Okay, what is your perspective on educating SMEs on sanctions programs, and is Treasury perceiving that as sanctions evasions? Okay, that's a good question. So there's some things that are different with sanctions, and let me start out by saying I'm not giving legal advice, so talk internally. But there are things that are different between sanctions and, for example, AML, anti-money laundering regulations. So if I have a case, an anti-money laundering case, and I'm looking to write a SAR or a suspicious transaction report on a customer, I cannot tell the customer that I'm investigating them. I cannot reveal that there is an investigation about them, etc. From a sanctions perspective, the list is public. I can say, we stopped your wire because it's going to this Russian oligarch's company, and I need to ask questions about it because it's a public list. The sanctions are public, and so there's quite a bit. There's a lot more educating that you can do within both your organization and with your customers. And in fact, one of the things that we have done is our customers that have had high levels of Russian transactions, we have called them personally, and we haven't said, you're bad because you're doing Russian transactions. We're like, here's where we see the Russian sanctions today. Here's what's problematic. Here's what we can do, and we kind of always leave it with, this is what it is today at this moment. It could change tomorrow, so you're proceeding forward at your own risk. So educating your SMEs on sanctions programs, I'm a big fan of that. Again, it's a lot easier to let them know kind of what the restrictions are and have them come to you with questions versus, oh, you mean we couldn't do this thing that we've been doing for the last 2 years, and blah blah blah. Like that, I see that as more problematic. Yeah, and I think, and that shouldn't be sanctions evasion. Like coaching you do want to be careful that you're like, oh well, here's the kind of thing that would be problematic. Well, it's going through Iran, so if you don't say Iran on that transaction, then it won't stop. That would be problematic. And I'm always kind of a fan of kind of including maybe more information to explain some things on a transaction, but almost always taking information out is bad news. And again, that's those billion-dollar bank payments, bank penalties that we mentioned earlier. Those were from banks that had a procedure that said take information out. So that kind of thing, problematic. But just educating people, I think, is a good idea. And as Paul mentioned, like internally, we have a monthly update on what the sanctions are and the sanctions issues.
Thank you so much, Jason. You can hear me clearly. I will try to speak more work for Arlene. So I'd like to ask you for a bank that works far away from here and what happens now in this country, like Azerbaijan, has very unique neighbor came from north and south. And those are I'd like to ask you for recommendations like what would be the best way to in such region, such geography that dealing with you were exporting to the United States and not get into the trouble. Thank you. try slow.
Okay. That was a really heavy question, and I got like every fifth word. But I'm seeing, okay, here's what I'm getting from Arlene. Some countries like Azerbaijan have interesting neighbors. What is the best way to support customers in regions like Azerbaijan who have customers in the United States? You're asking the toughest question.
We have two neighbors in North Russia and South Iran. To state of Maine.
You and I talked about this earlier. I think the first thing is to move and maybe get new neighbors. But in terms of, it's again, it depends on what it's a balance, right, that you're trying to strike there. The U.S. sanctions, for example, govern transactions that U.S. jurisdiction has coverage over. So if you're doing a transaction through the United States, you cannot that can't be like an Iran payment going through Azerbaijan going to the United States. Like, that's bad news. But a cross-border transaction that's strictly between Azerbaijan and Iran, like, U.S. sanctions don't apply to that. You run the risk of that secondary sanctions piece, but that's also targeting prohibited parties. So if I'm an Azerbaijan company that sells car parts working with a car parts company in Iran, and it's cross-border and it's small, and it's like that's not coming to the U.S. radar. It's not a transaction there. But if that Iranian company opens an account at your bank and then uses your bank to transact to the United States, then that could potentially be problematic. So, if again the higher your risk, the greater the controls that you need to put in place to, if you want to take that risk, the more controls you need to put in place to work with that. And I don't envy. That's kind of a sticky place to be stuck in there. All right, last question.
Thank you.
Joining virtually, and I think that kind of wraps up our session to kind of keep on.
Thank you, Jason.